He will log out.
What's that?
He'll log out. I sent him two of them. Anyway, it's just life. Misunderstanding. Okay. He'll log out in a minute. I hope it'll show up soon when he logs out.
Okay. So I am going to go ahead and start the meeting and record. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. Good evening, especially to our people on the East Coast. I know we have a lot of people joining us for the first time. If you've never heard of us, I just wanted to let you know that my name is Judy Kitt. I'm the president of the Foundation for Mind Being Research, which was founded in 1980. So it was founded by scientists and artists and alternative healers who were interested in exploring the nature of human consciousness. And so for 40 years, we met in person once a month in Palo Alto, really as a kind of forum for people who were exploring the nature of reality to present their work. So this included physicists and shamans and alternative healers and psychologists, really anyone who was interested in expanding the context within which we see ourselves and our world. That's what we're excited about. And so once the pandemic hit, of course, we moved online like most people did. So for the past 3 years, we've been here. And we have a website. You can look at it at fmbr.org. And all of our past presentations, especially since the pandemic, but even going back, are on our YouTube page, which is on YouTube. If you search FMBR TV, you'll see all of our presentations. So check that out. And this evening, I'm just thrilled to have Lisa Smartt join us. Lisa, I met just recently, and when you meet someone you just feel like you've known forever, it's just lovely. Lisa is a linguist, a book coach, and a writer. She's the author of Words at the Threshold, What We Say When We're Nearing Death, and the founder of the Final Words Project. She's worked closely for many years with Dr. Raymond Moody, guided by his research into language and particularly unintelligible speech. They have co-facilitated presentations about language and consciousness at universities, hospices, and conferences around the world. And so we're thrilled to have her join us this evening and present her work. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. So good to be here. And I just want to check logistically, are people seeing a full screen now? Because I want to make sure people will be able to see the PowerPoint. Okay, good. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here with me. I have been in kind of hibernation for the last year and a half, caregiving for both my mother and my daughter. And my mother passed away in February. My daughter is still in recovery. So it's been a really powerful time on many levels for me. And I'm so grateful to be here and able to share my work and the work that changed my life in so many ways. And one of the ways it really changed my life is it shifted how I felt about death and dying, which of course shifted how I feel about living. This year, I cared for my mother who was dying and who passed away in February. And the things I learned about people's final words and end of life enabled me to interact with her in a way that I never would have been able to had I not done this research. Dr. Kenneth Ring, who is one of the premier researchers in near-death experiences, talks about how those of us who have done research in end-of-life and near-death experiences catch like what he calls a benign virus, because it's contagious. When you start hearing the stories of people who have died and come back from life, or when you start hearing the stories at the threshold, it's contagious. You begin to have this feeling of the expansiveness that life goes beyond the portal. Because when you hear enough stories and see enough data, it's just hard not to believe something is going on. My feeling is what is going on is probably bigger than my mind can comprehend with the tools that we have. But I can say that through the research I've done, I'm really convinced there's some world beyond this one, or at least parallel to this one. Um, so I'd like to take 1 minute before I speak, just kind of invoke the ancestors. You know, this research was based on people who were leaving this earth and their language. So I just want to send my gratitude for the ancestors. I do believe they're with us and protecting us and guiding us in good ways. So, and to my mother who passed away several months ago, and my father who inspired this work. The PowerPoint I'm going to share tonight is based really on the work of my book and the research that was inspired by my father. I wanted to share one story, however, about my mother, because I mentioned how my work informed our interactions at end of life. When someone we love is dying, it's really obviously a painful process. There's so much to heal, so many words unsaid, so much history. And my mother and I were blessed enough, partly because of some of the tools I had gathered over the years of doing this research, that we're able to heal, do a lot of healing and speaking about things. So I just want to give one story about her before we go into the full-blown presentation. So she was dying and moving in and out of lucidity towards the end. And she, like my father, was a skeptic, did not believe in anything beyond this world. And but one day, we had been talking earlier in the day about my being single at 63. And she wasn't thrilled about it, neither was I necessarily. And we were just talking about it, and, you know, we were just chatting, and she was pretty lucid. And then she fell asleep, and she woke up, and she said, "I met God." And I'm like, that's incredible, because, you know, Mom, you've never believed in any such thing. And tell me. She said, you know, we got along pretty well. You know, he called me Susala, and he told me his name is Herb. Herb. And I was like, that's wonderful, Mom. And this Herb is no reference to marijuana or ayahuasca or anything. She meant like a nice guy from Brooklyn named Herb. And she said his name was Herb. And, you know, he told me about you. And you know what he said? I said, what, Mom? Herb said you need to marinate. You need to marinate a little, and then you're going to meet a man and get married when you're 64. Well, I got married a few months ago. So, you know, but there may have been a time where, you know, marinate, what are you talking about, marinate, Mother? You know, but it's like to give her the room to talk about Herb and marinating and to have this kind of conversation. It was so magical. And then I met this guy online. He came out to town, and he was here while my mother was dying. And she just said, you should marry my daughter. You should marry my daughter to Kevin, who I met online after he knew me about a month. And right there and then, at her deathbed, he got down and said, I'm going to marry you and take care of you so you can move on, Mrs. Felix, so you can go into the other world and know your daughter is going to be cared for and loved. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the magic that can happen is powerful and potent. And to trust the interactions we have at end of life, no matter how nonsensical or fascinating or bizarre they may seem. Okay, that's the end of my prologue about final words. So I want to share the more formal presentation now. Share. Thanks for your patience, everyone. A little bit about the research I did. Way back in 2013, my father died in 2012. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But I became very curious about the language we hear at the end of life, because as my father was dying, he began to say things I couldn't believe that would come out of my father's mouth, who was a skeptic. So I began collecting data, and I just want to give you an overview of that before I get into more specifics. It began in 2013 in the United States and Canada. In the beginning, it was mostly English speaking. It came from healthcare providers, friends, and family members of the dying. It was done in person, phone interviews, my website, finalwordsproject.org, Facebook, and email. We now have over 2,000 utterances, from single words to complete sentences and even pages and pages. And the language came from those who are a few hours to a few weeks from dying, representing now at least 200 cases, if not more. When I first began thinking about wanting to understand the language of the dying, because of the language I heard from my dad, which again, I'll speak about more in a few minutes, I decided not to use digital recorders at the bedside. First are the ethical issues, right? And the logistics. And what I mean by the ethical issues, the kinds of conversations people are having at end of life are oftentimes very, very private. And, for example, my grandmother said to me at her bedside as she was dying, "Lisa, you were my favorite. You were my favorite. I didn't want anyone else to know," right? So that's a very special moment, right? To have tape recorded that could have taken away a very precious connection. So when I looked at this and I spoke to other researchers, we all agreed that first, it was an ethical hornet's nest, because there were so many interactions that could be jeopardized by doing that. Then, of course, I found months later that my grandmother told everybody they were her favorite. And it's blessed that each one of us didn't know that at the time, or that wasn't recorded. Anyway, so what I decided to do is just have a journal bedside, so that family members and professionals and people who are willing to participate with the consent of the person who is dying could just write down things and then later decide what they want to share. So this is not, this is not completely blind or controlled research. It is definitely informed by personal decisions. Some people shared things and other things were not shared. So I just want to say that I know this is informal research, but we did the best we could to get the conversation going about death and dying and what people say. I talked to linguists, psychologists, clergy, palliative care and hospice care professionals, and neuroscientists, particularly Andrew Newberg, who's got a very wonderful perspective on the connection between the mind, the brain, and especially spirituality. And then I had my own direct interaction and observation of the dying, their family members and friends. And finally, my website. I got in many, many submissions through Final Words Project. And what I did is, once I got the data, I went to school at Berkeley to become a linguist. So I just organized by examples and accounts, by linguistic features and themes. I'm not a medical expert. I approached this study of death and dying through the lens of language. So this all began with my father. My father definitely did not believe in a higher power. He used to say, "I am a gastronomical Jew." And what that means, give me corned beef and a cream soda, and that's my idea of the divine. He didn't believe in God, and he was just a down-to-earth kind of guy, but a rationalist, and a rationalist as well. He had a PhD, the first in his family to get a PhD. And, if you couldn't prove it to him, it didn't exist. About 6 weeks before he died because he was over-radiated for routine prostate cancer. So there was, no one expected him to die when he did. It was unexpected that suddenly. But a few weeks he was vacationing in Mexico, and someone said, "Morty, write something on your hand to say a little about yourself." He said, "I'm a visitor. I'm a visitor on this planet." And it had now looking back, a very kind of precognitive quality about it. And it's not rare as we study what people say and do, as in the weeks or months before they die, that sometimes you can get precognitive reflections or statements even before maybe they've been diagnosed with any kind of serious illness. So my father, as I said, it was routine prostate cancer. They expected everything to be fine. But he got over radiated for a number of reasons one time. And when he came home from the hospital one night, he walked out the front door of the house in Berkeley on a cold January night in his underwear. This was not a common occurrence. My father did not do this often at all. He walked down, and when the police stopped him, he said, "I'm bringing these boxes to the big art exhibition for my wife's art show." My mom and dad were married 56 years. My mom was an artist, and he would always carry her boxes for her to her art shows. So he was obviously in a delirious state. And I wrote this down right away because of my training in linguistics, when I started hearing my father's language shift, I became curious and I started writing down everything he said. So when I heard that's what he said that night, the police mentioned that, I heard that he said that, I became curious. And what I later found out is these kind of pronouncements that have to do with our lives, our personalities and our life narratives are not unusual. And again, I'll go into this into much more depth in a minute. But that was the first thing he said that made my ears open and become very curious about what was going on with him. So I wanted to first share with you my father's final words. As I said, as soon as my father clearly was ill and started becoming delirious, he died over a 3-week period. And as I said, there was a mistake made at the hospital. And I just wrote down everything I heard him say. And here's a few samples of that. "When you're packing for Las Vegas, better bring the oxygen tent." My dad was a gambler. He was ready to get on a trip to the big Las Vegas. There is so much so in sorrow. One of the patterns I'll be discussing this evening is repetition is very common in end-of-life language. And when you look at this sentence, there is so much so in sorrow. He looked up at me. Technically, this is nonsense, and yet it conveys a lot of meaning. "I can't reach Jack. My modality is broken." Again, technically, this is nonsense, but he's communicating that something is broken. His connection to what we know as reality is broken. But Jack had already passed away, so he wasn't able to reach him yet. "Lisa, you were right about the angels." So here's my papa, who didn't believe in anything except, corned beef and rye. And one day I was sitting with him about 10 days before he died, and I was holding his hand, and his eyes popped open, and he looked up at the rafters, and he saw angels, and he said, "Lisa, you were right about the angels." And when he said that, I began to really think, I'm witnessing something I had no idea as a linguist or as a human being existed. Now, a lot of hospice, nurses know, and end-of-life professionals know about this, but I didn't. And I certainly wasn't trained in linguistics about these kinds of observations or statements at end of life. Introductory offer, stores closing. So this is a paradoxical statement, right? Introduction and closing. And that's one of a common pattern I found too, is paradoxical statements. It's also a common quality of near-death experience language. People have had near-death experiences often come back with very paradoxical statements. There are so many people in here. I don't have time to talk to all these people. Again, a very common thing, David Kessler, who is one of many end-of-life researchers, especially wrote book, I think it's called Crowded Rooms, that it's not unusual for people to see lots of people in the room with them before they die. He was talking to his editor. He was a writer, among other things, and he was talking to his editor right before he died, like 3 days before. And he was like, yeah, Alice, this is very interesting. I've never done this before. And this also caught my eye, and my ear, I should say, because I was curious, what's the this he's talking about? What is the this? Is it dying or something else? And this is called non-referential language because we're not clear what the this refers to. And that's also very common in end-of-life language, not having a clear referent. 3 days before my dad died, he said, the angel said, enough. That's it, enough. No one's to blame. Go now. 3 days left. And 3 days later, he passed away. As he came very close to dying, when I think the day before he passed, he called out, hurry up, get me down, please. And for those of you who might know about near-death experiences, people often describe during a near-death experience that they rise above their bodies. And in the Final Words Project, there are a lot of references where people are talking about moving up, moving back, moving forward, even though they're on their beds flat and there's actually no movement. And I call that prepositional nonsense, just prepositions that are nonsensical in our worldview. And the last words he said to my mother were, thank you, I love you. And those words are, these are sampling of the words that made me very curious about end-of-life speech. And I was curious, did changes in his language track changes in his consciousness? Was something going on? I mean, here it was a man who didn't believe in angels and suddenly he was seeing them. What was going on? So I began to think about the continuum of language, that, we have literal language that's very concrete and very, easy to understand. For example, this is a teacup and it's not debatable, right? I mean, we all with our 5 senses agree that that's a teacup. And let me move to the next. Come on, guy. There. Whoopsie. There. One more. Excuse me. There. So we have literal. So again, this is a rock. But then you have metaphorical, and you'd say that man, he's got a heart of stone. Now, of course, the guy doesn't have a heart of stone. He may act cold and so forth, but he doesn't have a heart of stone. And then there's something maybe totally nonsensical. Those rocks are chattering, or it's like the chattering of stones, or just something so nonsensical you can barely wrap your mind around it. And this is oftentimes the kind of continuum of language you'll see as people are dying. So we know from research with brain scans and, well, a variety of research, that regions associated with linear and analytical thinking is clear and purposeful. So there's, you can't say it used to be left brain, but it's a little more complicated than just left brain. But there are regions of the brain that are associated with more literal language. And then some of the research that we've found about metaphorical language, it seems to bridge more regions of the brain in brain scans. There's a really great series of articles in Scientific American about it. And then you've got nonsensical language, which Newberg talks about being associated with, nonsensicals also associated with more musical and mystical parts of the brain. And we used to, again, speak loosely about left brain and right brain, and then metaphor bridging left and right brain. again, it's more complicated than that, but these kinds of functions seem to form a continuum. And oftentimes, not always, what we see is this tracking. As people get closer to dying, the language becomes more nonsensical in certain ways, but the patterns are also more musical. You're seeing more repetition, and you're also seeing a lot more metaphor. So, did the changes in my dad's speech reflect physical changes associated with transcendental states of consciousness? I needed to know more. Because So what I did is I became really kind of obsessed with these questions. I went to the linguistics department at Berkeley, and there were people looked at me kind of blank-eyed, like, you want to study the language of the dying? Are you kidding? And so I just reached out to people, and I happened to take a seminar with Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience. He had a seminar a few months after my father passed in Alabama, and I went to it and was really impressed with him for so many reasons. And not only does he have an MD, but he also has a PhD in philosophy and specializes in unintelligibility, in nonsense. So on the fourth day of the seminar, he said he was looking for someone who might have some background in linguistics to study final words with him. And I raised my hand, and my life changed forever, because I moved to the South, and we founded the Final Words Project together. And both of us really one of our primary goals was to give the same attentiveness that we bring to researching first words. There's tons of research on language acquisition for children. And we decided, what about end-of-life language? Right? The only book that we knew about was Final Gifts, which is a spectacular book by two hospice nurses, but there wasn't much else. And Raymond felt, and I agreed, that we needed to get past the nonsense taboo, because so many of us, if we hear anything that sounds nonsensical, like there is so much so in sorrow, or my modality is broken, there's this tendency to completely disqualify or dismiss any language that's not of the five senses, that we clearly understand. And he calls it a nonsense taboo, and I agree with him. So we both decided to do a more systematic study of the unintelligible and in the language of the dying. And we wanted to compare and contrast that to the language of near-death experiences. So I'm just going to share a few categories with you, and I'll speak until 6. And I probably won't get through all my material, but I really want to be in conversation with people about what I'll speak about until 6 o'clock. And so here we go into some of the categories. The most prominent, I think, and that has been spoken about by Calnan and Kelly in their book, Final Gifts, is metaphor. As I mentioned in that continuum, one of the things that we find as people are dying, somehow, suddenly we hear much more metaphor. And there are 3 types of metaphors. There's metaphor of personality, of the momentous, and of journeys. It's really funny. I have this big ray of light shining on me. It feels like a little bit of a blessing, but I'm going to just shut the door. Please excuse me for 1 minute. There. Okay. So one question is, do we die as we live? And in many cases, it seems that way. My father announced the big art exhibition. This big thing was coming, and it related to something really dear to him. One participant in the final words described, My dad had been a roofing contractor and carpenter during his life. At my father's bedside, when he was dying, he would awaken and look over at me and smile so big. And he told me they had all these kitchenettes over there. There were miles and miles of them, and he would be helping to build them. He certainly was having an amazing time during his passing away, judging from the smile and excited look on his face when he would wake up. So the metaphors that greeted him as he was dying had to do with something close to his life narrative and his personality. I don't think I'm going to be thinking about, I won't be seeing bathrooms to remodel on my deathbed. Maybe, but I don't think so. So here's a few more examples of the kind of metaphors we might hear at end of life. Renowned dancer and choreographer Jeffrey Holder. Arms, 2, 3, 4. Turn, 2, 3, 4. Swing, 2, 3, 4. Down, 2, 3, 4. And then he took his last breath, and that was reported by his son, who wrote about it in the New York Times. My dad said he was a poet. I see interim spaces of poems. Jack Spicer, another poet, said, my vocabulary did this to me. Oftentimes, it surprised me how many samples we got from golfers. I didn't know there were so many golfers out there. And they would refer to like a foursome, that they were going to make a foursome, so that there was a threesome waiting for them on the other side, and they needed a fourth, and they were going to be a fourth. And that metaphor also came up with card players, like people who played bridge. A couple times in the samples, people referred to being called to be the fourth. They're telling me I need to come and sit down beside them and smoke and drink. And I just think I'd rather stay here in my chair, right like this. But they tell me now I have no choice. I got to play in the big poker game. Guess I'm just going to have to join them. That came from a daughter who participated. Or the big dancer dinner. That's really common. My mother asked me to bring her best dress and shoes to the hospital because she was attending a grand ball that night and be so happy to see me there. Another person. She woke up in the middle of the night and started getting dressed in a long gown that was in the back of her closet. She was sitting at her dressing table, putting on jewelry and makeup. Nana said, I'm getting ready for the big dance. She then lay down and died. So they're announcing some kind of momentous moment, but they're very closely connected to the metaphors of their lives. I might be one of those people who talks about the big dance. My mom talked a lot about the big party and the party she was planning, and she was definitely a party animal, my mother. You'll also hear metaphors connected to the weather. The tide is turning. The reservoirs are filling. The storm is coming. Do you think the rain is coming? So these are all, and many of these we saw frequently, several cases of them. And then the one that's, I guess, in some ways the most well-studied and by several authors, Robert Fenwick wrote about it. And as I said, Callanan and Kelly did. The euphemism of death is a journey. And it's almost universal from what I could tell. We haven't done enough research yet to say it's actually universal. But I got entries from people around the world who had similar. My suitcase is packed. I have to go. The car is packed. Where are the keys? Jetta. I need to get my Jetta. You hear that plane going over? Is that coming okay? That is the coming of day. The trolley is near. But again, metaphors of travel are very, very common. One chaplain shared with me a story of someone who was talking about his passport and needed help gaining access to his passport. So these are really common. And if you look over in time, the way death has been described with like the river Styx and so forth, you know, and the canoe person, you know, taking people across the Grand River or across time, you know, across space. It seems to be a very powerful, I'm going somewhere, right? And then there are also takeaway figures, people who come to take the person away. My father is here. I have to go. The angel said, enough, enough. Earl is here. One woman described to her daughter that was her husband. Right, I'm ready. So a couple of people described hearing their loved one say that. Well then, goodbye. I'm ready to leave now. I think I will go now. One woman described how her husband, she said, honey, do you want some grapefruit juice? And he said, no, honey, I'm done. And then I don't mean to laugh, but there was such a sweetness about it. No, I'm done. And she told me with sweetness, or else I wouldn't respond with a smile. So I had mentioned earlier that repetition is common. And what I call this intensified language. And at the end of life, you see more intensified language than you would in ordinary, healthy, day-to-day life language. Repetition, repetition, repetition. One well-known one that some of you may have heard was Steve Jobs of Apple Computer. His very last words were, oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. So you can only imagine what he saw beyond the threshold to have said that. And as we all know, that repetition is also a very common trait of meditation and prayer, and the language of incantation and kind of dimension shifting, right? That we equate repetition with kind of the language of magic. The language of dimension shifting. Exclamations. One person said, it's all in one piece. It's all in one piece. It's all in one piece. What you see in different pieces, it's all in one piece. Right? It sounds like a poem. And someone had said that at the very end of, I believe that actually this was a gentleman who said that. And it's very common to hear people talk about things that are broken becoming one, or everything is just one thing. Oh, more worlds and worlds, so profound, so powerful. Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. But every once in a while, people are talking about all the universes out there too. And again, this was not Steve Jobs' quote. This is someone else who also said, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow, at the end of life. You also hear the other side, the more challenging, help me, help me, help me, I don't want to die. We received a lot fewer of these kinds of samples, but it could just be that people who heard this kind of language didn't want to share it. So I can't say that, that they're less frequent, but they were less frequent in our sample. But a lot of the language that we heard at end of life felt very promising and hopeful to us. It's time to get up, get up, get up. One of the things that most captured my curiosity and my interest is something called sustained narratives. So as I mentioned, people had these books near their loved ones' bedsides and they would write things down. And so over a period of time, we could look and take maybe one or two sentences or bits of things and then look over time what kinds of narratives they created, right? So if you walk just to my room, let's say I'm dying and I walk in and I go, that damn train is stuck. And they're like, grandma's losing it. I don't know what she's talking about. She's crazy. because in isolation, it wouldn't make sense, right? But what we found in a number of cases, grandma might say, that damn train is stuck. And then the next day, I think it's coming in at the station. And then maybe 3 days later, what's that bell over there? I hear it clanging. I think it's the conductor's coming in. Anyway, what happened is a narrative's created, and it's created over time. And this is where my imagination really became stimulated or awakened, because I thought, for me, if you were to ask me what I said last night, like if I were, and then to do a sustained narrative for you over a period of 10 days, I don't think I can remember what I said 3 days ago. So I found it remarkable that there was this storyline or a narrative that people were following over days or usually days, not quite weeks. So let me give you a more specific example. This one gentleman, I see the champion, he's here watching me. A couple of days later, the soccer champion's back. Then again, the next night, this time he has the son with him. They're together now. And then the next day, they're in a big parade. I'm watching them now. And then again, he's back. He does not have his son with him this time. What does he want with me? Why does he want me? So it's like this story. And then here's another one, November 9th. I'm concerned about the traffic going north. Now we're about to enter in now we have to get ready. Communication north. By communication north. Yeah. The railroad. Yes. It should work smoothly like that. Yeah. Lots of wreckage. Interior. Lot of wreckage. Interior. Sorry to wake you. No water. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for the damage. Later that day. Dear, our connection in the north has made an error, has made a wrong turn. He may not correct for it. It looks like our train, which is going north, will be in violation. November 27th. Are you testing my engine? I'm saying, are you testing my engine? Let me reverse if what I need to do is to reverse. December 1. I thought of something under my control. The railroad stop. And then I don't want to go through all of it, but then as the narrative ends, he talks about the trains here and then the journey to his dying near. And so I just found these sustained narratives really intriguing. And we didn't collect a whole lot of them, honestly, but just the fact that there were some of them intrigued me and still intrigue me. The other thing that I found, and to me, it hints at some kind of consciousness beyond our regular consciousness, the ability to carry this story kind of like in a dreamlike thread. The other thing that is only now that people are beginning to speak about that was just completely compelling to me is something called terminal lucidity or sunset day. At the end of life, often right before someone dies, if they've been speaking kind of nonsensically, or even if they're non-responsive, often there'll be a very small window of time where suddenly they're super lucid. And the old conventional idea is that there's a surge of adrenaline before people die, and that brings back lucidity, which is, that is very, very possible indeed, right? But in some cases, you have people who have brain cancer, incredible degradation is the only word I can think, but problems with their bodies, and suddenly they're able to put together complex sentences. And let me give you better examples, but it just seems to me to hint that there's a consciousness existing or in play here beyond what we're used to in this plane. So, and oftentimes it's associated with food and eating, which is kind of interesting. And of the things people say during that window when they become really lucid after not being lucid, or even in a coma and they come up to say something, it's usually words of love and forgiveness. I've never, in the samples that I've seen, it's not something like, oh, your husband's such a disaster. It's rarely, never anything like that. So, for example, arising from a coma 2 days before dying, this woman's, I think it was a sister, said, tell everyone I'm okay and that I love them. Came out of the coma to say that and then went back. Like, What's that about? Where did that come from? One person described how the father was completely non-responsive, and then he just got up one day 2 days before dying and said, could you get me a beer and take me out to the veranda? And they did. And they did, of course. And another person we interviewed, her father-in-law was always very critical of her and not very nice. And just before he was dying, he came out and looked at her and he said, I never noticed how beautiful you are. I'm so sorry. Here are two more examples of terminal lucidity. And this one is pretty dramatic, and I know the person really well, so I know that this is the truth. I know that he was not exaggerating. It was the truth. John's mother had Alzheimer's for 3 years. During this time, he understood very little of what she was saying to him. In the last 3 weeks, she went into a coma, but 2 days before she died, she woke up and sat up and explained to him, the files are in the 3rd drawer down in the study desk. Everything you need to know about the finances are there. I want to make sure it's all easy for you. I love you. Indeed, everything he needed to know to, tie up all the affairs for the estate were right where she said. He had not known that before. Again, to me, it means that some kind of consciousness is operating. That's mysterious to me and hints of maybe another dimension. Karen was sitting next to her boyfriend who had fallen into a coma and was completely unresponsive. Until one morning at dawn, he stirred, sat up, looked at her with a kind of radiance around his face. He said to her these 5 words, it's not what you think. And then died an hour later. And that sentence, it's not what you think, that's that non-referential. We don't know what that it means, right? We don't know. So I'm gonna wrap up by talking about nonsense and doing a brief overview, because I really want to hear your stories and hear your questions. But first, let's start with the nonsense taboo, which I mentioned a little bit. We're afraid of language that we don't understand. And nonsense is often used pejoratively, and obviously I don't use it that way. But what we're finding is different nonsense has different effects on people. And Raymond's done a lot of research into this. But when you look at end-of-life language, it's pretty much limited to just a few types of nonsense. But I am hoping for my last days to look more at the kinds of nonsense there is and dive deeper into it. But we need to get rid of the taboo. So when someone you love speaks nonsense, I would encourage you to imagine you're hearing a second language or a foreign language, just like you wouldn't judge Chinese as being a whole bunch of crazy people because their language is not intelligible. There's that sense of curiosity and wonder. And so Raymond and I are hoping with our work to bring that sense of wonder and curiosity about nonsense, things that don't make sense. When I was interviewing people, I interviewed this person who is a nurse in Trinidad. And he explained to me, in my country, in Trinidad, the nonsense people speak before dying is called traveling. So there's actually a word for it that's connected with this idea of traveling. So one type of nonsense we see in end-of-life language is very common in near-death experience. So for example, you may hear someone say, I've never felt as alive as when I was dead. Now, that makes no sense. On the surface, that's completely nonsense, right? Or I had the most amazing conversation with my beloved on the other side, but we didn't talk at all. It was not done with words. right? So you'll hear these kind of paradoxical things that for our five sense, for our reality, it makes no sense. It's nonsense. But I like to think of it as just that, not sensory, nonsense. So some of the kinds of things that you see in end of life speech, could you persuade the staff to grant me half a full measure? Introductory offer, you saw that earlier. I don't think there's progress in winning and losing again, but you see a lot of this. It's just kind of fascinating. There's that prepositional nonsense that I had mentioned earlier also. I want to pull, and you see this in NDEs. So here's someone lying in bed, maybe they've just technically died and they have a near-death experience. So they're lying, as a matter of fact, they're dead, right? They're moving, right? When they come back and they report about their near-death experience, it's a travel narrative. People describe, going through a tunnel often and having a life review, and there's movement. But again, technically, it's complete nonsense. I want to pull those down to earth somehow. I don't really know. So this is end of life language rather than near death, but it's just, I wanted to show you the parallel between near death experience and end of life. No more earth binding. Help me down the rabbit hole. Hurry up, get me down, please. It's the end. I've got to get down to earth. Help me. No, wait a minute. You are one stop from real hope, which means one stop from real hope. I am living between two places. Would like to make my place mark the other place remarkable. Again, the other kind of nonsense I had referred to before is we don't know who or what people are referring to. Like, this is very interesting. It's very beautiful over there. Thomas Edison was recorded as saying that, and a lot of people, that's a very common, I've heard, it is very beautiful over there. Too bad I cannot tell you of all of this. It is called a hoax. It is all a hoax. That was from Roger Ebert. He said it's all a hoax as he was dying. He described it's all a hoax. It's not what you think. It's all an illusion. So you don't know if the it that's an illusion is where they're going or where they're leaving or somewhere in between. So again, technically it's nonsense if you're seeing people in your room when there's no one there, right? Technically. So I see him, I'm coming. It's so common to hear these kinds of things. There are so many people in here. I don't have time to talk to all these people. Don't you see him there? There he is. My mom was speaking to my stepdad who died a few years ago. She was telling me how much better she felt when she saw him. Here's Mom, I have to go. My father died on a Friday morning. He spent the entire Wednesday before that talking, sometimes out loud, and sometimes muttering under his breath to a whole variety of people he had known throughout his life. It was the most amazing thing that I've ever seen. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. Oh, I think I'll do this one and then we'll wrap up and go to questions and comments. Another thing that's really common is it's like one foot is in the perceptible, the sensory reality, and then another foot isn't. So get me my checkbook since I have to pay at the gate. Right? There's no gate, but there used to be checkbooks. We don't use those as much anymore, but I need my pearls for the dance tonight. Imaginary dance, but real pearls. Help me down the rabbit hole. Please massage my feet so I can get down into the rabbit hole. Get my camera. Nowadays we'd say, get my phone, but this was someone who had a camera still. Get my camera. I need to take a picture of this. They left the ladders. And the person was pointing to ladders in the yard, but the ladders are too short to go up there. Where are my glasses and computer? I have to get to work. So these are 1 foot in this world, 1 foot in some other world. Again, technically nonsense, because part of what they're talking about does not exist to our senses. Nonsense. I wanted to just mention the research that was done by Christopher Kerr and his team, End of Life Dreams and Visions. 87%, they studied 500 people. This is a physician and his medical team. This is, my research was definitely informal, but this is the real deal that he did in terms of the real deal, in terms of being, well-controlled research. 87% of the study's participants reported dreams or visions about loved ones, about reunions. Okay, so, excuse me, reported dreams and visions. 70% were reunions with deceased loved ones. That's a lot. And that's really remarkable. 52% of the visions were related to themes of preparing to go somewhere. So you can see these dreams kind of are the other side of the language. If people are having these dreams or these visions of travel, it's appearing, of course, in their language. Yes. So, sorry about the typo here with the visions, but these, when people have visions and even dreams of loved ones or takeaway or travel, of course, it often lessens their anxiety and fear of dying. And several people have done beautiful research into the dreams of the dying, and they'll see this kind of progression, just like I saw kind of a progression in language to greater and greater metaphor, even to what we call nonsense. You see in dreams people coming to greater and greater comfort and ease with their own dying, because it's scary stuff, right? But as people connect with loved ones on the other side and have a sense of another place that they're going, the fear is often, not always, but often diminished. Whoops, I just hit something. I wanted to just mention one last thing that I thought was really fascinating. Let me stop the share. When I spoke to hospice nurses, what they described to me, because, of course, if people are taking meds, it's going to affect them. I mean, I can't even take, it affects us, right? So, but what was so interesting to me from what I heard from Dr. Kerr's research and the people I interviewed is that when people have visions, they tend to speak in complete sentences often. And when they have visions, it's more kind of cryptic. And the hospice nurses I interviewed said that oftentimes there's a very different quality. Like with visions, you can go back and forth between what's real and not. It's like, could you pass me the orange juice? Hey, Earl is over there. There's this more sense of kind of a lucidity and flexibility. And the language of maybe that's medical hallucination versus vision is different, is more cryptic. And so I just thought that was really interesting to hear that. And I haven't really studied that in detail, but that was an interesting thought. So, in the 10 years that I have collected this data, I have so much data now from the Final Words Project, and I'm going to actually just put it out there if there's anyone interested who would love to work with me and see some of the more recent data. I have almost twice as much, and I just haven't been able, because of my own personal life and challenges, to really go through it. This beautiful, beautiful data we have to go deeper, because I feel, Raymond and I both feel we've only just begun in looking at the language of end of life. But what it hints to me is that there is something beyond some of the kind of consciousness. Oh, I have to tell one more story right at 6, right? One more quick story. Kenneth Ring, who I had mentioned before, who's one of the premier researchers in near-death experiences, research people who are blind. And it's an amazing book. And what he wanted to know is if people, when they had near-death experiences and they were blind, what would happen to them, right? Because so much of what people describe as visual, right? I see myself looking down at my body. Well, 80% of people who were blind, and in his study, everyone except two, I believe, were congenitally, born at birth blind, were able to see themselves. I mean, the book is Mind Sight, Sharon Cooper and Kenneth Ring. That's mind blowing to me. I mean, what is going on? What is seeing? What is looking down and seeing yourself? And one woman said, I knew I had long hair, but I'd never actually seen my hair until, and the descriptions of how they see, it's like a kinesthetic awareness. They can see it and feel it. It's not the kind of vision that we may have, but I still like that idea. Ken calls it transcendental awareness. This kind of awareness that seems to be above us. So as I did this research, I really got a sense of this other kind of transcendental seeing or awareness that comes from non-sense, not from the senses. So I wanted to end with that incredible research that Ken did.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I mean, I can't wait to hear what people have to say. If you have questions and you want to type them in the chat or the Q&A, go ahead and do that. If you want to talk to Lisa, if you want to just raise your hand, you can unmute. Let me know that as well. I wanted to tell you, Lisa, my husband would have really gotten along with your father so well, because his idea of heaven is a Katz's pastrami sandwich on rye and a cream soda.
That's great. Well,
That's
it is. It's pretty divine.
It is pretty divine. I was thinking about when my father passed away, he was non-responsive. I don't know what his last words were, but we were all there with him. And just before he died, for hours, he just was not, his eyes were closed. But just before he died, he opened his eyes. He looked past my mother up into the corner of the room and smiled, this big smile, and then he died. And we all kind of looked at each other and went, what was he seeing? What was he looking at? And I always just assumed it was somebody coming to get him, somebody he loved.
Beautiful. Ooh, gives me tingles. And it's so common, until I did this research. I mean, not to take away from your experience, but that is much more common than I had ever experienced.
I think so. Yeah. Let me see. Just wanted to say thank you. I wanted to ask you about, I took notes. If I can read my notes. Oh, when you talked about the nonsensical, the metaphoric, the literal, the metaphoric, and the nonsensical, and you talked about the nonsensical, that sense of connection to music, kind of a musical pattern with repetition and mystical experience. I think that's so amazing. Just, the connection between music and mystical experience, and then how language would be used to describe, or I don't want to say describe, because that brings it kind of into the literal, but I don't even know what my question is, but I just wanted to note that musicality.
Yeah, because it really seems, the research that he did with brain scans is that, if I remember this correctly, that when someone reads out loud, it's a very different part of the brain than when they're listening to music or meditating. And like, if you think about jazz, like she bop, bop, beep, bop, 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 it's very different kind of language, and it's a different, it really seems, we used to say left brain, right brain. I'm nervous about using those terms, but it's a very different part of the self, I think, of who we are.
Lila has a question, and I'm going to, Lila, if you want to.
Oh, Lila.
Is it Lila?
Yes, that's right. Hi, Lisa.
I haven't seen her since high school, I think.
Oh my gosh.
Haven't seen her in like 40 years, 45 years. It's great to see.
Oh, so good to hear you.
What you've done. I ordered your book and I was reading it earlier today. One thing that I wanted to share on this, when my grandfather died, he died of a heart attack. So it was very sudden. But my mom, who's here with me and who remembers you and your mom, my mom Joy, she said that her mother, who was there with him when he was dying, said that he was reciting some kind of a Bible verse about they shall rise up on wings of eagles or something like that. Neither of us knows the verse well enough to recite it, but it was something like that, rise up on the wings of eagles.
It's in Hosea. It's in the book of Hosea.
Do you know the whole thing? I'd be so curious.
I don't. I can look it up for you though.
Okay. And Mom, did you want to say anything?
Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful.
No. My stepdad died a couple years ago after having Alzheimer's. And I wish that I had known about your work then, because I have a vague memory of going to see him at the hospital, and he was kind of mumbling and saying something, but as you said, unintelligible. And I wish I had known to pay more attention, even though it seemed nonsensical and unintelligible. I wish I knew what those last words are, because after that, he became non-responsive in the last week. Mom, do you remember if he said anything?
No, he never did.
Yeah, he never
And
did
he
after
didn't
that.
open his eyes either.
Yeah.
His eyes were closed. But we stayed with him in his last days. We would visit him every day, and we played music and we talked to him, and
we sang.
And we sang to him, and he responded with squeezing of his hands and things like that. So we knew that he was responding, that he was sensing our presence.
Yeah. Beautiful work, Lisa. And I really want to connect with you offline.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear from both of you. I remember you, Joy, and Lila. Of course, I remember you. What a joy. Thank you. What a pleasure.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Thank you, Lila.
Thank you, Lila. Joy.
Was it in your book, Lisa, that you mentioned, I've heard this said before, that the hearing is the last sense to go, and that the hearing is often, I can't remember how you said, like vision is not dependent on the eyes as much, hearing is almost not dependent on the ears, right? It's kind of it's a bigger sense.
Yeah, one person I interviewed for the book, I love this story. She talked about how her mother had become pretty non-responsive. I mean, she would talk a little bit, but pretty non-responsive. And so one day she just decided, instead of, it was a big loss for her because she had such a great rapport with her mom, and it was really a loss to not have that, of course. And so she just decided she was going to pray and meditate and be in communion with her mother on that level. So she sat there and just imagined talking to her mother and just held her hand and just, was like praying and communicating that way, non-verbally. And it was just very quiet. And then the nurse came in and said, Mrs. Smith, time for lunch now. I'm coming in. How are you doing? And the mother said, oh, I've been having the most incredible conversation with my daughter, and closed her eyes again. So, what a mystery. What was that?
Yeah.
What was that? So
what is that? So there's an anonymous attendee who just tells this story, how she took care of an 80-year-old woman until 3 months before she died. It says, I took off and engineered an old caregiver she loved to come back. I went to stay at a yoga center, and one day ended up taking care of a bird that had been injured for someone one day. In order to make the yoga, I had to leave the bird for an hour in the entry room. The bird died. I suddenly got it, and aha, that this woman had passed away as well. I called the family, and yes, she had passed away that afternoon, and I felt very close to her. It's another realm, right? Another realm of time.
Yeah, and birds seem to be a very powerful messenger of the other world.
Yeah. Sue, now, how can you tell when someone switches from everyday language to end of life language?
Oh, it's pretty, you start hearing more metaphors, and you'll start thinking, it'll be like, it's those moments you want to go, Mom, what? Or yeah, it's pretty clear. I mean, for example, my dad took a pencil and it's like, yeah, I want to get this through to the other side. And this was when I didn't get it because I was still in the beginning of this research. Now I get, he was saying he wanted to get through to the other side, but I took the pencil away and, Dad, you're going to hurt yourself. But I think the language gets more metaphoric. And just when you kind of start hearing yourself go, huh? What do you want? I think it becomes relatively clear. And they may sound like my mother told me and was telling everyone, she was passing away, that she won this huge lottery from Uzbekistan. And she started giving money away to people. She started telling people she had a lot of money. So even though she sounded really lucid, she didn't win a lottery and stuff. And she didn't have dementia or Alzheimer's. So there was a shift. And, so yeah, it's a really good question. But I think usually there's a kind of, huh?
Like when you kind of, yeah. I love the idea, by the way, of keeping a journal at the bedside so that people can just know if there's something where it kind of goes, wait, what? Just to track that, because I hadn't really thought of that idea of a continuing narrative that you talked about that might take place over the course of weeks or months or something like that. It might be really illuminating.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the metaphor of traveling, of journeying. And I noticed that one thing you said in your book is that the journey almost always includes outside agency, right? You said you've never heard anyone say, I need to get my shoes on, right? I need to go for a walk or grab a horse or something like that. There's something that's coming, a train or a bus or a plane or
yeah.
That's an interesting distinction.
It
right?
really,
People aren't going on their own power.
They're really, and it really, barked at me. To notice that. And there was one exception at the very end. Of course, the moment you make a conclusion about anything in life, there was someone who said, I'm going to put my sneakers on. And she didn't say she was going to cross, just I'm getting my sneakers on. So,
but there's a lot of that, like getting ready to go, right?
Yeah,
getting ready to move on.
Yeah, but there really is a sense that there's an outside agency, and and when you look at the construction of the sentences, it's even more impactful because you can just feel generally this whole sense that something's coming and taking me away. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about what you said about people who, just as you were saying, actually, that I was thinking how hopeful and positive all of this sounds, and it kind of makes me happy. And then you notice, the people who are saying, no, I don't want to go. And your caveat, right, that this is self-reported, and maybe the people didn't report, people who weren't as ready to go. Yeah. I wonder about that, because I know someone who died like that, and I'm just wondering about. I don't know what my question is. I'm just thinking about, like, as people who are witnessing, right? As people who are witnessing this amazing transition. Is it helpful? Would it be helpful for us to invoke this idea of journey, right? To speak in those terms, to maybe help. I'm sure there are hospice people who know this, but yeah. Do you have any advice for people who would be sitting with someone who's dying, who might not?
Yeah, I would first, sort of meet them where they are. So use the language and the metaphors, and where they are. So they may not be, on the train yet. They might just be waiting at the station, and start where they are, because you want to pace them. You want to be where they are and get in rapport. and not go ahead of them, but go along and maybe speak with them and support them on the next journey. So for example, there was one nurse, you may have seen this example, but one nurse and the patient was saying, get my Jetta, get my Jetta. And people kind of freaking out because like, what's going on with this patient? Because he was like really agitated and he wanted his Jetta. And the wife was, oh God, the car's down the street. I don't know, how can we do it? And then the nurse came and said, Mr. Stevens, we're getting the car all gassed up for you. We're pumping up, we're putting air in the tires, and, you're going to have a great trip. So she stepped into his world. And, my mom, again, I'm just, she really had a very different death than my father. And she thought that there were cameras in the house and people were watching her. And so, really engaging, almost like and I don't mean this disparagingly, but almost like with my daughter when she was younger and she would see things or have imagination, but take it for real. Like, don't discount it, but just being in conversation with my mother in ways that can, hold her and create safety for her like you would a child. And again, I'm not saying that in any disparaging way, but you are that person's steward, in transition. And so, what I did do with my mom is I read her accounts of near-death experiences because she didn't believe in any of it. And, I said, these are real stories from real people, just to give you some ideas of what can happen. And the truth is that death is scary. Our bodies go through a process where biologically it's like, and there seems to be this transition as we get closer to dying, where suddenly the body stops fighting the reality and it's just we're animals as well as spirits, right? Mm-hmm. And there's this process of coming to terms with the anxiety. And for me, what I've witnessed, and I believe this is my belief system, is that there is something there. And but it doesn't always, it's like birth, right? I don't want to sound negative, but some people have these beautiful births and some births are hard. And I don't want to, but with near-death experiences, there's a small percentage of hellish near-death experiences, but the majority are speaking of a very powerful and beautiful afterlife. And there seems to be a process, like Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote Proof of Heaven, he talked about this period in his near-death experience that was kind of dark in it, but as he went through it, then he kind of broke through to another level. And it's very similar to birth that way, I think. But yeah.
There's a question here. Was there any difference in language depending on the cause of death? Mm-hmm. Cancer versus heart disease or something like that. Long-term illness, short-term illness, or any difference in language based on any sort of belief in the afterlife or lack of belief?
I think in terms of belief, the first one, Raymond and I looked at that, and even with meds, because in the beginning we were concerned about that, but we didn't see really, in terms of illness, but of course belief systems, there's going to be a lot of difference, just in terms of, you're probably not going to see Jesus at your bedside if that hasn't been part of your belief system, though there were some people who did. But some people see Buddha, some people don't see any figurehead, but just see deceased relatives and stuff. So, but it is formed by our life experience. There is, because, again, this is my belief system, but there's some kind of higher power, and that higher power has a different face for different cultures and different people, I believe, obviously, and that face is going to appear depending on your cultural filter. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is, I know some people, I hope I don't offend anyone with that, but that's what it looks like.
Yeah. There was one thing I also wanted to bring up when you were talking about this language of metaphor. I was remembering there's a book I love by Jeremy Narby called A Cosmic Serpent. And when he talked about it as a microbiologist going down to study ayahuasca experiences and shamanism in the jungle. And I was looking through it today because he talked a lot about the language of metaphor. And as you approach spirit, there's a quote in there. It says, shamans say that when you speak with spirit, it's always in metaphor, right? It's always in symbol. It's always on a level that's not literal. And so you kind of have to be in that world. And I was thinking about the kind of elevated spiritual experience and how it kind of tracks with this near-death experience and the dying process. It seems like, right, as you lift away from the body, and the density of being in form.
That's very much my experience.
Yeah.
Really
interesting.
Yeah, and I love Jeremy Norby too, but yeah, that's very much my experience, and that's why I really invite people. And I think it's really easy, especially if you're entering a hospital room, which is so sterile and cold often, or even if you're walking into your loved one's room and they're dying. It's hard. It's a hard space to be in, and I would have never thought before I did this research that I was entering the territory of the myth or shaman. I mean, I didn't have that belief. And then when someone you love can't communicate with you in the ways that you're accustomed to anymore, it's really scary. But to imagine that you're entering, the words of the threshold, you're entering into another space, even if they're unresponsive, to think about how can you meet your loved one in a different way and be open to mythical and poetic language. There is so much so in sorrow. I mean, what a beautiful sentence. Right? I mean, just poetry, right? And there's so many words spoken like that, and at end of life, and yeah, it is like a mythical. You're entering kind of the realm of the mythical, and you're moving in and out of it. There are times where it's very mundane language, and sometimes it's painful and hard too.
I love what you said earlier about being as witness, right? You're really acting as steward. And in a lot of ways, you're taking on that role. And what you've said about just, being with people and meeting them where they are, it requires some humility on our part and some willingness to just be surrendered about, like what our expectations are. And then that's a spiritual experience in itself.
And some people talk about having shared death experiences, at their loved one's bed. They may have a life review, or they may see the soul rise. I mean, really, people have extraordinary experiences that shift their belief system in really, really deep ways. And I think, I would encourage people, if they haven't done reading, and by medical, by docs who are writing about this stuff, there's so many now, Bruce Grace and Jeff Driscoll, there's so many doctors who are talking about what they've seen and experienced with the near-death experience, and to have that information so that, if you are a steward, you're not just carrying your own fear and terror around losing someone you love and watching a body die. It's hard. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's hard. But if you've got this reservoir of information, and also for me, because I'm very analytical, from medical professionals and so forth, I feel everything in my life is informed by the work I've done. Even my daughter being very seriously ill now with long COVID, I feel like I can hold it in a way that I couldn't have held it without all the research and information I've gathered, in the last 10 years by working with Dr. Moody and all these other wonderful researchers. So, yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely lovely. Well, I don't see any more questions, so people are being quiet now. I think maybe we've exhausted the questions. So I will just take this opportunity to say thank you. This has really been wonderful. Your website is finalwordsproject.org. Org. Okay, so if you want to learn more, if you want to contact Lisa, if you want to be involved in her research, go to her website, finalwordsproject.org. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a good night and a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Great.